So, the War Scythe is probably one of the worst weapons in the game. Why, you may ask? Well, if you didn't already know, the War Scythe is a weapon in this game that you can get as random loot, or from this corpse in the present version of Mahabre in the area where you unlock the shortcut to the central square. It's a two-handed weapon, and it does relatively low damage, but it does have a special gimmick. According to its description, it can hit multiple targets. And, you pick it up and you read that and okay, you think that's interesting, right? Especially for a boss fight coming up that does require you to hit multiple targets at once. And you think that's great. You can use it for that, right? Wrong. In order to explain why, I also need to explain one of the mechanics of Fear and Hunger that you probably don't know about unless you're familiar with how RPG Maker works. And that's how accuracy works in this game. At least assuming the developer left everything at default. So, whenever you attack with a weapon, spell, or item, the game actually rolls a few checks. If you pass all those checks, then you land the attack. One of the first checks is hit rate. Hit rate is pretty easy to understand. It's actually a flat 97% chance on all playable characters. So 97% of the time, that first check will succeed. The next check is evasion, which is based on the enemy. And the way this particular game works is that usually most enemies actually are divided into multiple body parts, and each body part has their own evasion rate. For a lot of body parts, like the torso, the arms, and the legs, they tend to have a low evasion rate at 5%. So 95% of the time, the second check will succeed. There are also some special body parts, like the head, that tends to have a higher evasion rate. There's also something called magical evasion. So just to explain that real quick, sometimes certain attacks are categorized as magical attacks. So instead of going through normal evasion, they has to go through magical evasion instead. Also, magical attacks tend to have a 100% hit rate, so it will always pass the first check no matter what. And I guess another small note is that there's also a third category of attacks called certain hits, and that's for kind of special stuff like items, for example. The purple vial, because it's categorized as a certain hit attack, will always succeed the first two checks, as mentioned before. So that's how it works so far. But there's actually one more hidden check that's not very apparent to the player, I feel like. And that's invocation. Specifically, the invocation success rate, which determines if the attack, spell, or item even works in the first place. If the invocation check fails, at least in this game, there really isn't any visible indication that it did. The same animation plays, and then, it looks like that you just missed, right? So for example, Pyromancy Trick has a 92% success rate, meaning 8% of the time it will just straight up fail. Notably, Pyromancy Trick is actually categorized as a physical attack, so it actually goes through all three checks. Another spell, Pheromones, has a 95% success rate, meaning 5% of the time, it will fail. Now, why does a situational support spell that targets your own party members to give them taunt have a small chance to fail? I don't know. The developer just hates you, I guess. But anyway, so how does this all relate to the War Scythe? Well, I'm glad you asked. Because for every other melee weapon in the game, it uses a skill called Attack, which is how you attack normally, and it does have a 100% success rate for invocation. However, the War Scythe uses a separate formula that's different from all these other weapons. The developer even graciously noted here the specific ID for this special attack. And if you look at here, and here's the kicker, the invocation rate for the War Scythe is 30%, meaning 70% of the time it will miss. The curse version technically does use a different attack ID, but it's the same formula. What's even worse is that you cannot compensate this like you would with the bone shears with hit rate increasing items such as the monocle or the eyeglasses, because hit rate isn't the problem, it's invocation success rate. So yeah, that's why it's pretty horrible. It misses most of the time, it does low damage, and it kind of goes against the typical strategy in this game, which is to usually focus on one part of the enemy rather than spreading out the damage. If you're really lucky, then I can see this weapon being somewhat useful in situations where you gotta hit like low HP limbs on an enemy, like the legs. Kind of works like a pseudo leg sweep, but it's just kind of unreliable. So I wonder if maybe the developer was just kind of testing it and trying to balance it, but as it is, in its current iteration, it's probably one of the most useless weapons in the game. I don't recommend using it. So yeah, that's my little rant about the War Scythe. It's a very niche thing to talk about, but I wanted to get off my chest. I hope it was informative as well. I tried to explain some of the mechanics of this game that might not be super obvious to most players. Again, I'm assuming this is how it works through default RPG Maker, but I'm not entirely sure, so let me know if I'm just completely wrong. But otherwise, there you go. Not sure if I'll do more content like this necessarily, maybe a couple more. So if you're interested, don't forget to subscribe. You can also check out other content on the channel. I did do a full playthrough of this game and got all the endings, including hard mode, so you can check that out if you're interested. But yeah, thanks for watching. Until next time, see you then.